Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 2023 ICES Research Forum Workshop, Inclusion of Disability in the Research Life Cycle. My name is Lesley Plumptre. I'm a staff scientist at ICES. I'm excited to moderate today's session, and I've had the pleasure of working with a few of the speakers that you'll hear from today. So today's workshop will highlight the importance of disability and accessibility in the research process, how to use administrative health data in the measurement of disability, and accessibility considerations for conducting inclusive health research. So I'd like to introduce the three speakers we have today. Dr. Amy Freier is a woman, a person with a disability, and an interdisciplinary researcher. She is a research associate at the Manitoba Centre for Health Policy and the Inclusion, Diversity, Equity, and Accessibility Lead for Health Data Research Network Canada. Dr. Freier's research interests include health equity, data curation, and human rights. Dr. Hilary Brown is an assistant professor at the University of Toronto in the Department of Health and Society and the Dalalana School of Public Health. She is cross-appointed to the Temerity Faculty of Medicine's Department of Psychiatry and is an adjunct scientist at Women's College Hospital in ICES. Dr. Brown holds a Tier 2 Canada Research Chair in Disability and Reproductive Health. Her research program examines maternal and child health across the life cycle, with a focus on populations with disabilities and chronic illness, health equity, and the social determinants of health. Dr. Yona Lunsky is Director of Healthcare Access Research and Developmental Disabilities Program, or HCARD, and the Azraeli Adult Neurodevelopmental Center at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health, and professor in the Department of Psychiatry at the Temerity Faculty of Medicine in Toronto. She is an adjunct scientist at ICES and a clinical psychologist. Her work focuses on identifying and addressing health disparities experienced by people with developmental disabilities through innovative partnerships. So during this presentation, there's an opportunity to ask questions using the chat function. There's also a questions function and a raise hand function. Hopefully you see those around your screen. I'm going to share my slides here and I will be driving the presentation. And I would now like to pass it off to Dr. Freier to get us started.
Thank you for that introduction, Lesley. I'm joining you this morning from Winnipeg, Manitoba, which is Treaty 1 territory and homeland of the Red River Métis. As Lesley mentioned, my name is Amy Freier. I am a pale woman. I have curly hair, and this morning I'm wearing a green top with a beige knit sweater. And I'm really excited to be talking with Hilary and Yona this morning about disability and accessibility in the research process. And my talk will primarily focus on the supports and strategies that we can use to think about inclusion of accessibility within the supports and strategies that we give to researchers, research teams, and as we think of all the structures we have in place around the research. So not just about the research question or the data that we might use, but about the process itself. So if we could go to the next slide. My work currently is within the area of inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility, and I'll situate that a little bit further in a minute or two. But I wanted to bring this up as to say, I think a lot of people will be very familiar with the term equity, diversity, and inclusion, so EDI. And there's been a lot of different variations on this term. So we see here JEDI, so Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. We have EDIA, Equity, Diversity, Inclusion, and Accessibility. And then we have some other terms around equity, diversity, inclusion, and indigeneity, or equity, diversity, and inclusion, and Indigenous reconciliation. And so there's a variety of ways that we can think of and enact accessibility within our research process. I have moved towards using IDEA, and I'll give some context and background as to why, especially in the frame of accessibility. So the origins really of EDI programs, or equity, diversity, and inclusion programs and strategies, are really rooted in the backdrop of the 1960s and the US Civil Rights Movement, when schools, businesses, and government institutions started highlighting the value of diversity amidst the need for racial and ethnic integration. Initially, really, equity and inclusion were peripheral to these programs and trainings, and this early work really focused on providing education and language to ease racial tensions that benefited the employer or the institution more than its workforce. Slowly, diversity work expanded to incorporate other differences such as sex and gender, sexual orientation, and abilities. And over time, diversity education really became more coupled with inclusion and equity to underscore the need for action and full participation in employment through through someone's entire experience within an organization. So not just that you're counting who is in an organization, but what their experience is throughout their time there. So within academic institutions and programs, which is where we're more closely tied with this presentation around research, programs like Athena Swan, which started in the UK, have really championed equity issues based on gender. And only recently, with its adoption in Canada under the program Dimensions, have other intersectional identities been more fully considered within academic institutions. I'll editorialize a bit here and say that from my perspective, we're really just beginning to have conversations about the real inclusion of disabled people within academic institutions and research programs, and we have a fair way to go with this. The academic value on intellect has often worked to exclude people with cognitive and speech conditions, amongst other conditions. And this also really holds true for people with physical disabilities who may not be able to work the long hours, which are now seen as normal within the academy. I would say there hasn't really been a true reckoning with some of the metrics that we use to evaluate academic researchers. And when we think of equity, diversity, and inclusion initiatives, they often work to promote and perpetuate ableism in different ways. So if we can go to the next slide. So I have moved to working with the set of concepts around IDEA, so inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility as a way to guide practice within research organizations. For me, this orients us towards justice and emphasizes action. It purposefully and prominently includes accessibility. And within the scope that I work in, it works to operationalize both things that we traditionally see as part of EDI programs around hiring and mentorship, but also things around the data research process. So the tools that we have to promote more accessible research practice. With my thinking, I like to hope that we can move from not just thinking about whether our research is ethical, but really thinking about whether our research is inclusive, whether it's diverse, whether it's equitable, and really whether it's accessible. So we can go to the next slide. I'm doing this work within the context of the Health Data Research Network Canada. This organization was really established in 2019 as a way to make cross-regional research using administrative data easier. We know it's very cumbersome to try and use data from, for example, Ontario, Manitoba, and for BC. And trying to make this process easier for research to harness the value of this data is what HDRN is trying to achieve. So if we can go to the next slide. Some of the partners, and I know the images are very small, you can see the full list on the HDRN website, I believe hdrn.ca. But some of our partners include data centers who hold administrative or routinely collected data across Canada. So for example, Pop Data BC, the Manitoba Centre for Health Policy, ICES, who is hosting this event today, StatCan, CIHI, amongst many others. Next slide. So within HDRN, there are a number of working groups and teams, and I am leading one of those teams, which is the Inclusion, Diversity, Equity, and Accessibility team. And this team has really just been established as of January 2022. And as of now, we have about 30 members on this team from HDRN Canada member organizations, so the data centers from our other working groups and teams. And we've also opened this up to SPOR support units who are not part of the HDRN network, knowing that there is a lot of overlap between our interests in this space. And so in our time together, we've really worked to build capacity around IDEA, share information, coordinate the development of policies, practices, and tools, although we are very early in that, with the shared goal of shifting culture ultimately. And this is just one of the vehicles that HDRN is using and supporting to ensure that the practices that we're developing as we think about cross-regional research are reflective of IDEA itself. So can we go to the next slide? One of the things that we did as we started working together last year is we understood that we needed some common or shared understanding about what inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility really mean. Because we're all coming from about 15 different organizations, we may have slight variations on what these terms mean in our organizations or how we operationalize it. And so we started with this audit of what definitions our organizations were using. And when it came to accessibility, although this might not be surprising if you're embedded in this work, only 2 of our organizations out of about 15 had a definition for accessibility. And so, and both of those definitions that were existing really were designed very specifically about physical or technological barriers. And so we worked with a researcher out of the Maritime SPOR Support Unit to come up with this definition of accessibility, which I will read now. So for HDRN, accessibility refers to the design of products, devices, services, or environments for people who experience disabilities, as well as the continuous commitment to the removal of political, social, economic, historic, and systemic inequities that limit full participation in social space and life. To fully address accessibility, we must commit to addressing systemic ableism, oppression, and historic inequities encoded in policies, practices, and services. And so our definition for accessibility really became a way of signaling how ableism and how accessibility was really enmeshed in different social stratifications and different ways that people have been oppressed in society, and not just seeing it as advocating for accessibility very narrowly within physical or technological spaces, but also knowing that accessibility really refers to this full participation in social life, which is entangled with other oppressive barriers. Next slide. So some of the things that we have emphasized thinking about how accessibility is going to be practiced in the network is really ensuring to work to understand individuals' accessibility needs and recognizing that their needs may change, and I'll talk a bit more about that. Providing confidentiality for disclosing, so ensuring technology and format needs are met, and then using little to no jargon. I know at the top of this I spelled out EDI, EDIA, all of the different acronyms that we use, but that's really a way to ensure that we're all starting from a place of shared understanding and not assuming that someone might have that knowledge just based on us being in this space. Next slide. So we're trying to take a really holistic approach to accessibility, both in policies and practices, and knowing that disability may be permanent, it may be temporary, or it may be situational. And also understanding that it may be cognitive, visual, auditory, physical, or verbal. And we wanted to state this very clearly because, as we know, disability is one of the only characters of identity where you can enter or sometimes exit at any point of your life, either due to illness or aging. And so it can be quite a fluid category, and it can be quite a sudden category for people to reckon with in terms of their position within an organization or institution or research program, and how they can continue to contribute to those places that they work and research in. Next slide. One other thing that we've done in the last year is really think critically about our communication, and knowing that clear communication is really the baseline for full participation within research. And so one thing that you may or may not have noticed is the slide design for this slide deck. We really worked to ensure that color contrast was up to the standards that we should think about around accessibility, using appropriate fonts. Sans serif fonts are best for people who have dyslexia or other reading disabilities, and then using appropriate white space. And this is all built into our slide decks at this point. Some other things to consider, either limiting the use of images, using alt text if you're going to be sharing your slide decks as a form of communication, or when you're presenting, if you're not doing those things, ensuring that you're describing the images that you have if they are critical to the flow of information on your slides, so that everyone gets a piece of that information and can fully understand your presentation. Just a few other things when using hyperlinks, they should be described. And then I know, especially when we're doing presentations around data, we should avoid merging and centering any cells, because that can be very difficult for a screen reader to navigate later on in a communication process. And there are a lot of other strategies that can be used that can be found through Microsoft if you're using PowerPoint, and lots of other tips online. The next slide. So this is just one example to show how color contrast really does make reading and understanding what is on your visual presentations much easier. So the column on the left has the appropriate color contrast, while the column on the right does not. And you can just see how it becomes much more busy, and you have to do a lot more work to read the text on the right. And so these are the colors that we use within HDRN, but if you're interested in learning more and ensuring that your presentations consider color contrast, there are a number of free checkers. This is just one that we have used, WebAIM, that can help you do that. Next slide. So there's many other ways that we can consider accessibility throughout the research process that isn't just within a research question. I'll just highlight the first two here, knowing that Hilary and Yona will take it up on the other couple points. But when we're thinking about team formation, really ensuring that we are offering those mechanisms for people to confidentially disclose their needs. They don't have to disclose a disability, but disclose their accessibility needs. And make sure that that is available throughout a project and throughout your organization. Within grant applications and funding, we can think about this in a couple ways. One is with just writing in the application how you might consider accessibility or disability within your data research process. But we can also think about within the funding section, really ensuring that we're putting in budget lines around things like closed captioning or translators, things like that, that will help you create more accessible research. I will leave that there for now, just knowing, that Hilary and Yona will go further into detail about data methods and analysis. But there's many other ways that we can put the supports in place from the beginning to make sure that people on your team and within the research process can actually have access to the research itself. So next slide. So within HDRN, I'll just provide this overview of our work to date. And again, it's fairly early days that we're working in this space within the last 2 years, really. So we've done some engagement with across the network. We've formed our IDEA team. We've done a lot of accessibility training and upgraded our own standards, and we're currently updating our website. We've almost finished the process of creating definitions and principles for us to work from around inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility. And we've also worked on some projects around HDRN's data asset inventory and doing an environmental scan. Next piece, and one more. So upcoming work, which will also obviously include accessibility within it, it's that we're developing an IDEA strategy using an implementation science approach. We'll be offering some disaggregated data learning, and we're also working on outcomes benchmarks that have KPIs and measures included with accessibility. And finally, there is a presentation right now being given by Dr. Ahmed Garg around the clinical trials training program that will use pragmatic data, so administrative data within clinical trials. And we will be providing some support to that program as well around considering accessibility within their program. So that was a fair amount to go over, but this is kind of where we're at, and hopefully that does give some very practical information and guidance on considering accessibility and disability outside of the research question. And I think that is it for me. If we can go to the next slide. Thank you for listening, and I will pass it to Hilary.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Amy. As Lesley mentioned, I'm an assistant professor at the University of Toronto. I'm speaking to you from my home office. I'm a white woman with brown hair, more gray these days, and I'm wearing glasses today. So I'm going to be speaking to you about measurement of disability and health administrative data. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So in thinking about this topic more from the methodological side of things, I'd just like to start by reminding us of how common disability is in the population. So in Canada and worldwide, between 20 and 25% of individuals have a disability. So that's more than 1 in 5 individuals. And the frequency with disability advances with increasing age. So in other words, people with disabilities represent one of the largest, if not the largest, so-called minority population, and yet their health and healthcare experiences don't tend to be examined in population health research. So what we'd like to argue today is just about the importance of inclusion and measurement of disability in population-based research, and I'm going to go into some examples of how we can do that with our existing data sources. Next slide, please. So before I get into some of the measurement considerations, I want to start off by mentioning some of the major models of disability. There are a number of different frameworks and models for understanding disability. So this is certainly not a comprehensive overview, but I want to mention kind of 2 of the major models that tend to come up pretty frequently. The medical model of disability is sort of the historical model that's been used frequently, particularly in medical settings. This is a model that has tended to view disability as a medical problem or something that can be prevented or treated or rehabilitated. So in other words, the focus is very much on impairment. This model has really been criticized in recent decades because it does tend to have the notion of disability as something that is so-called pathological. On the other hand, the social model of disability recognizes that disability is independent of health and in fact results from the environment or structural factors that might impact or limit participation in society. So if we think of a really simple example of this in terms of our physical space, A mobility-related disability would really only be disabling when there are stairs, but no ramp or lift or elevator. So that's sort of an example of how disability is created by the environment around us. Now, the social model does acknowledge that people with disabilities do experience or can experience disparities related to health and mortality, but it acknowledges that these disparities are really driven by these structural barriers and social factors that I mentioned. So the reason why I mention these models here is because these models do influence the ways that we measure disability. So for example, the medical model of disability does tend to focus on measurement of impairment or diagnoses, whereas the social model has tended to focus more on self-reported activity limitations or participation restrictions, again, recognizing the role that the environment plays. And so what we'll really kind of show you today is that in the context of our health administrative data, we are somewhat limited in our ability to measure disability using a more social model of disability. But I will highlight a few examples of what we are able to do at the moment and what would be great to be able to do moving forward if we're able to integrate other sources of data into our health administrative data sources. Next slide, please. So I want to highlight a couple of algorithms that are available currently for measuring disability in administrative data, starting with an algorithm for measuring intellectual and developmental disabilities that was developed by Yona Lunsky and her team here at ICS and CAMH. And really, one of the important sort of factors to understand behind this particular algorithm is that Yona was able to use both diagnostic codes as from health administrative data, as well as information on receipt of disability-related supports from social services data to more comprehensively identify intellectual and developmental disabilities in the population. So on the health administrative data side, what we're able to do is use physician billing codes and ICD codes in emergency department visits and hospital admissions to identify diagnoses associated with intellectual and developmental disabilities in a person's health record over time. And that identifies quite a few individuals, but is shown in this Venn diagram on the right-hand side here. Using health administrative data alone really only identifies about 2/3 of individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And being able to add in social services data on disability income support receipt identifies another large proportion of individuals who would otherwise not have been identified in health administrative data. And likewise, social services data alone doesn't identify everyone with intellectual and developmental disabilities either. And I'll get into some of the reasons for this in a couple of slides, but in the meantime, I think the important sort of message here is the critical nature of having access to multiple different data sources to triangulate to be able to identify these disabilities in the population. Next slide, please. More recently, we've also been able to start identifying physical and sensory disabilities in health administrative data as well. And this is something that my team has worked on quite a bit in the context of reproductive health and a little bit in the context of COVID-related outcomes as well. And to do this, we've used algorithms that were first developed in the United States and that we adapted for the Ontario context. So for physical disabilities, for example, there are algorithms to identify musculoskeletal disorders, neurological disorders, permanent injuries such as spinal cord injuries, and congenital anomalies like spina bifida. And this does rely on diagnoses, again, available through physician billing codes and diagnostic codes in ED visits and hospital admissions. But what has been helpful about these particular algorithms is that there has been some prior validation work done showing that the codes that are included are correlated with measures of functional limitations as well as need for accommodation when accessing healthcare. So not perfect, but some sort of indicator that we are capturing conditions that result in disability. And one addition that we've made to this more recently has been to also take measures of assistive device use from an additional data set available at ICS to try to understand mobility-related limitations based on a person's use of wheelchairs, walkers, and other devices. Again, not a perfect measure, but it does sort of give us more of an indication of the types of barriers an individual might experience. And then on the sensory disability side, there are diagnostic codes available for blindness or low vision, as well as deafness and hearing loss, again, that have been shown to reflect those disabilities in the population. Next slide, please. So one question that sometimes comes up is why not use other measures of comorbidity? So I think many people who are here today will be familiar with indices like the Charlson Comorbidity Index or the Elix-Hauser Index, which we often include in population health research as a general measure of morbidity severity based on healthcare utilization patterns. And I think one of the critical considerations here is that these healthcare patterns don't clearly or consistently reflect disability specifically. And these indices also don't include all disabling conditions and diagnoses. And so simply using a measure of comorbidity is really not going to reflect disability per se. I think it's also important to recognize here that disability and health are distinct constructs. And often what we see in research sometimes is that ideas of disability and illness are conflated, which really sort of falsely presupposes that people with disabilities cannot be healthy. And the problem with this construct is that this really does prevent public health attention on health disparities, for example, related to mental health or physical health that might be experienced by people with disabilities because of barriers accessing healthcare. And so it's really important to remember that disability and health are distinct constructs when we're measuring them in health administrative data. Next slide, please. So I just want to provide a couple of examples of why it's so important to measure disability and health administrative data. And I've chosen a couple of examples from Yona's work and from my work as well. And these really sort of illustrate some of the disparities that we see in people with disabilities in the population. So for example, Yona's done some really important work during COVID showing rates of hospitalization, admission to ICU, and mortality within 30 days of a COVID-19 positive test in adults 18 years of age and older who had Down syndrome and those without intellectual and developmental disabilities. And what she showed was that there are much, much higher rates of these adverse outcomes in people with Down syndrome compared to the general population. And this is really critical because, as we know, our COVID-19 response has really not considered the needs of people with disabilities in the provision of vaccination, priority groups, as well as some of the safety measures that have been put in place. And so we really require data on the disparities that people with disabilities experience in order to inform a better pandemic response. So if we're not able to measure it, we're not going to be able to address it with our public health response. So again, really, really critical for having data on this population in order to inform good public health strategies. Next slide, please. Likewise, my team has applied some of the algorithms around intellectual and developmental disabilities, sensory disabilities, and physical disabilities in the context of reproductive health care. Again, this is an aspect of healthcare that has typically not considered the needs of people with disabilities in the provision of services. But our team has shown that during pregnancy and in the first year postpartum, all disability groups are at elevated risk of severe maternal morbidity and mortality, which are clearly devastating outcomes that, although rare, really signal important disparities in the population that could be prevented through more accessible and inclusive pregnancy-related health care. So again, we need to be able to measure these things in order to be able to address them, underlying the importance of measuring disability in the population. Next slide, please. And one final example, again, in the context of reproductive health, we looked at experiences of violence resulting in an emergency department visit in pregnant and postpartum people with disabilities, again, showing higher rates in populations with physical, sensory, and intellectual and developmental disabilities compared to the general population, with particularly high rates in the group with intellectual or developmental disabilities that had an unadjusted relative risk of 11. So 11 times more likely to experience violence in the perinatal period, again, underscoring the importance of measuring disability in the context of reproductive health. Next slide, please. So I think it's important to acknowledge, though, that our algorithms are imperfect, and we need to acknowledge these imperfections when we're interpreting our data, and also use this information to advocate for inclusion of better measures of disability in our health records and subsequently our health administrative data. So as I mentioned, when we started talking about models of disability, simply using diagnoses to make inferences about the barriers that people experience or even their functional limitations is not perfect science. And I use the example here of quadriplegia versus multiple sclerosis, both diagnoses that are measurable in health administrative data, but for which it's very different in terms of our ability to make inferences about people's experiences. So for example, with a diagnosis of quadriplegia, one might be able to make some assumptions about what the experience of that person might be like navigating their environment and interacting with healthcare providers on the basis of that diagnosis. On the other hand, with multiple sclerosis, there's clearly a really wide range in terms of individuals' experiences, where someone with multiple sclerosis may have no or very minimal symptoms and really not experience a large impact on their life, whereas another individual might be using a wheelchair, for example. So simply using a diagnostic code for multiple sclerosis to indicate a certain type of disability really sort of hides a lot of the heterogeneity in experiences that people might have. Likewise, it's really critical to acknowledge that not all individuals with disabilities even have a diagnosis. And an example that we frequently see in this context is the idea of chronic pain, where someone may experience chronic pain but not have a label to put on why they have it. And I think we'll actually start to see an increase in the number of individuals with undiagnosed disabilities in the context of long COVID and some of the very difficult experiences that people have been having. So this is going to become an increasingly important issue that won't be captured in health administrative data without self-reported measures of disability. Likewise, even in the presence of a diagnosis, disabilities tend to be underreported in health administrative data because the focus of most healthcare encounters tends to be on acute problems. So, infections, injuries, things that you need immediate treatment for. If someone's diagnosed with a disability very early in life, for example, we might not see that diagnostic code pop up again later because they're not necessarily accessing healthcare for that disability, but rather for their other healthcare needs. And using the example of quadriplegia and multiple sclerosis again, there's been interesting research showing that only 57% of people with quadriplegia and 58% of people with multiple sclerosis have diagnostic codes for these conditions in the year after their initial diagnosis. So again, depending on your look back period of how you're measuring these things, even if someone has a diagnosis, you might not be capturing it in their health administrative data record. And then finally, as we know, diagnostic codes themselves are limited in terms of their accuracy and completeness. We're, of course, relying on the people entering the data at the point of care that these things are entered correctly. And so that's a consideration as well. Next slide, please. So there's a number of recommendations that I'd like to mention, and these are based on literature that's discussed some of these options. So there's been some literature recommending the inclusion of measures of functional limitations and not just diagnoses in health administrative data. One example that's been given is the World Health Organization Classification on Functioning, or ICF, And this is not diagnostic, but a functional limitation sort of assessment that is included sometimes in routine reporting in home care and rehabilitation services in several countries. One of the major barriers to using this more broadly is it's very extensive and complicated to complete. So it would be quite time consuming for a provider to fill out, but there are many ICF versions that have been used that could be useful. However, of course, there's also some limitations with these measures as well. So one recommendation that has been made is to actually include self-reported measures of disability in health records. And this is a recommendation that's been made alongside the advocacy for other equity-related variables like race and ethnicity and gender identity. So if we're adding those types of variables, which would obviously be fantastic, perhaps it would be possible to add measures of disability as well. And I'll point out here some work that Dr. Andrew Pinto at St. Michael's Hospital has been doing on how to measure patients with disabilities in the context of primary care. So there's a screenshot of one of his studies on this topic, routine identification of patients with disabilities in primary care, published in the Disability and Health Journal. Next slide, please. However, as we know, adding these data elements to health administrative data can sometimes feel like an uphill battle and may take many years to complete. So in the meantime, a couple of interim recommendations. If you're measuring disability in health administrative data, I think it's important to remember to link records across time to ensure that disability can be identified in multiple years. So again, using the example of a diagnosis made in childhood that might not appear later in one's health record, but still be a chronic or permanent condition, we need to be able to measure things over time in order to capture those diagnoses and not just look, the year prior to our index date. Likewise, linkage of health administrative data with other administrative data sources is really critical. So for example, disability-related income supports, as in the intellectual and developmental disabilities example that I gave earlier. This does better reflect in some ways, beyond just diagnoses, participation restrictions. However, it's important to point out that those sorts of data still only capture people receiving those services. So you still need to meet certain eligibility criteria. Often that's based on having a diagnosis. And so we're still going to be missing people without formal diagnoses or with other, self-reported measures of disability. Another recommendation that has been made is linkage of health administrative data with other forms of data. So for example, sometimes the census will include measures of disability, for example, the Washington Group short set, which, if available at an individual level, is an interesting and important measure of disability that could be used. And likewise, there's been some work done on using machine learning methods to try to have better classification of disability status using existing data. But for this, I think it's important to be mindful that we know that machine learning is only as good as the data that's put into the system. And so there's some caution, I think, to be used with some of those approaches. Next slide, please. So with that, I think I'll end it there, and I'll turn it over to Yona to talk more about the research process. Thank you.
Thanks, Hilary and Amy, for getting things started. I'm going to try to, look at other aspects of the research process. So I'll introduce myself. I'm Yona. I'm a white, middle-aged woman with graying, dark curly hair. I'm wearing a black shirt, and I'm here at CAMH, which, according to colonial records, was once the council grounds of the Mississaugas of the New Credit. So if we go to the next slide, and if we hit enter, I think two images will show up. And I want to talk about, I think, the two problems that I think we have. Hit enter one more time, Lesley, and we'll see if that works. There we go. So I'm going to describe two images on the screen. The first one is an image of men in a room in Huronia, which was one of our former institutions in Ontario. And there's a lot of white sterile beds in 2 rows. And the sort of heading on top says, "We don't see them." And I think this is a historical sort of recognition, or sort of, I thought, an important visual, just to remind us that when we think about disability, certainly developmental disability, which is where I have, I guess, the most expertise, but more broadly as well, we have this history, I think, in medicine, which has, impacted how we do health services research, where literally we weren't seeing disability because people were somewhere else, right? People were outside. We had people who we didn't think were worthy of the same kinds of care or experiences, and we just didn't see them, so we didn't study them, right? And then the second image, it says we don't see them, and here the C is emphasized, and it's a photo of several dogs all facing the same direction, and there's a little brown fox right in the center. And I think that's what goes on with healthcare today when it comes to disability, particularly maybe some of the more invisible disabilities that we don't notice as obviously or as quickly. But I think it also happens in our healthcare research. So if we don't count disability in terms of what information we collect administratively and look at and report on, then we're not seeing this population. We're not seeing disparities. We're not seeing opportunities for accommodation. And it's, I think we're a very polite society in Canada. People often say that when they talk about our country versus other countries. And we might say things like we treat everyone equally or everyone belongs. But we know, and we've certainly heard with other marginalized and disenfranchised populations, that way of doing things doesn't allow us to really address or acknowledge what is going on sometimes. So I think by not seeing this population in the work that we do, we're really causing some harm. I guess the other comment I want to make looking at these photos is that either way of making disability somewhat invisible has harms associated with it. And I think it impacts how we work with the disability community in the research that we want to do. So sort of recognizing or understanding this history or people's experiences when we ask them to come to the table is a really important lesson, certainly something that I learn and keep relearning sometimes through some of the things that I do and some of the mistakes that I make. So if we go to the next slide. So it says here, relationship building, it matters. And there's a photo, and it's an image that I'll show again in a later slide, capturing myself sitting with a number of self-advocates with intellectual disabilities and one of the other researchers from our team. And we're talking with them about what some complicated and actually disturbing results are from work that we were doing with ICS data, looking at concerning health outcomes for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, including premature mortality and other really upsetting things. And I like this picture because we're just having a conversation. We have some slides we're looking at. We're trying to understand, this is before we finished our report. We're trying to see, can we explain what we found to this group? Can they understand it? What do they think about it? What does it mean? And then how can we work those voices, even though it's administrative data? It's not their voices in the data itself. There's no qualitative study here, but how do we work together with this group of people to sort of understand and then explain what we're learning in our study? And I think at the end of the day, when we do work and we consider disabled people in the work that we're doing, we need to think about the relationships that we have and different things we can do to sort of foster relationships. So another quick story, I was thinking about another project we did where, really early on, we said, we're going to have an advisory. We'll have people in policy, we'll have clinicians, they can advise us, but we're also going to have people who have disabilities advising us in this work. And it's going to be great. And we're going to have a meeting. We'll bring everyone together, and we'll make sure that we've considered some of the technical things, that it's accessible to everyone who's sitting in the meeting. We'll give everyone a chance to speak, and we're really going to figure out how to work as a great team. And, from the scientist perspective, we thought this was an important step. We've done a good job here. And after the meeting, we were approached by some of the individuals who were disabled or identified as having disabilities about concerns they had. And it was like, why are you concerned? Didn't we do great? And we can always do better. And I remember approaching the meeting, there was a lot of trepidation, what's going to happen here? What do we do? And it was just an opportunity to listen, to be reminded, for example, of what it feels like to be in that room with those other people, of information we think we're explaining fairly simply, but how it comes off or is understood by people who, again, have this history of engaging with researchers, with scientists, with health providers. And all that extra work, I think about how beautiful a swan is swimming on the lake and underneath the water, how quickly their feet are moving, how much work it might take for a person you invite to the table who's disabled to try to be ready for that event or activity, to follow along, and then to sort of decompress and process things after. So it was actually a fantastic conversation, and our job, I think, was really just to listen and be humble in that. And over time, we fostered, different ways of doing things and better ways of doing things. And I think that can be the story in every study. But I think really coming down again to what's your relationship and recognizing if it's not that strong to start with, or if you're still growing that relationship, or even if it is a really well-established relationship with a disenfranchised population that you're working with, how much work you can continue to make that relationship better. So if we go to the next slide, I have a few pointers around that sort of engagement period, because you might be thinking, want to do this work, but what do I need to do it right? So I used a slogan here that's really important to the disability community: nothing about us without us, with regard to study planning. So first of all, think about, does it make sense for your meeting to happen in person or virtual? That has all new meeting now since COVID. So a lot of people have become better at virtual meetings, but there are some people who I think may not be able to follow certain things that are going on in a virtual meeting that would do better in person. And vice versa. There's some people who, particularly in the disability community right now, may not feel as safe or comfortable being in an in-person meeting. And also there's a lot of pressure or sort of accessibility issues around sort of getting to meetings, getting through everything in the meeting, not just the actual meeting, but the washrooms and the wheel trans or the accessible cab, and again, that energy it takes when the meeting is done. Keeping in mind, this issue of tokenism, it's very easy. Well, it's not easy, but it's easier to invite somebody who you think has a particular disability to advise or work with you on a project and help you plan. But it works much better, I think, if you have multiple people. And we've seen this across a number of studies that we've done, especially, again, thinking about COVID. People can't always stay in the picture. If you have a disability, other things are complicated as well as all the complicated stuff we all deal with. And so someone might have to bow out at a certain point. So it's helpful to have multiple people. It's less pressure on one person. But also there's different people have different perspectives, thinking about Hilary's comment around multiple sclerosis and how different it can look. So it's important to have multiple people with different perspectives. It also gives them a bit more strength. So I think they feel a little bit less disenfranchised in the meetings themselves. Sometimes it makes sense to invite different people with different disabilities to a meeting that's happening with other groups, for example, scientists or clinicians. Sometimes it might make sense to have smaller groups. So some of the work that we do in the area of intellectual and developmental disabilities, I feel more comfortable sometimes having meetings just with a group of folks who have those disabilities as advisors, because the speed at which we talk about things, the way other people talk about things, like as we're sort of building that capacity, sometimes it's more comfortable to have that more adapted meeting. Thinking about what you give to people before meetings, how you organize it, how you, for example, assuming if you send everyone links that they can just click on them and read everything. I know for people with developmental disabilities, it could be much more helpful if they have things on paper sent to them in an organized binder. We shouldn't assume that people all have the same access to computers and that they can find information in the same way. Thinking about actually supporting people in meetings. So we have someone who's kind of like a liaison or support person, if we're going to include someone with an intellectual disability in advising, who can kind of answer specific questions, help them understand certain things, and just kind of be there to give them a bit more confidence and help them participate as fully as they can. Know before you start your study, do your homework about different people's perspectives on the issue. You can't know everything that's going to come up, so be ready to find out something you didn't think of. But it's important to understand, how people would think about a research question that you think is important, because you might, inadvertently do something that's really quite upsetting right at the get-go. So I think understanding things is always helpful. And keeping in mind as well language around disability. So you'll notice that I've talked both about disabled people and people with disabilities in my language, and that's on purpose. Different people are comfortable with different terms, and particular disability groups are much more comfortable with identity first language. Other groups are not. So I think understanding some of those things and what our words mean and how it impacts people is really important. So if we go to the next slide. Okay, so there's a lot of stuff on this screen, and I'm just going to sort of talk about what it means because it was a particular example that stood out for me. So it says nothing about us without us, and we're looking at the impact or how we work with disabled people when it comes to interpreting data, even if it's administrative health data. And it's focusing in on a COVID study. So the first sort of column highlights a study that was published in the British Medical Journal on risk prediction of COVID-related death and hospital admissions for people after their vaccinations. It was a really big study, very exciting, very important. And there were some findings, particularly about people with Down syndrome, showing greater risks. So there were a lot of headlines that came out right after that. So one headline here came from a very popular online resource called Disability Scoop in the US. And it says, study among vaccinated, those with Down syndrome face highest risk from COVID-19. People with Down syndrome are the most likely of all vaccinated adults to die from COVID-19, new research suggests. And then underneath that is a response. And I was part of this group of researchers who are international, working in the area of trisomy 21 or Down syndrome, where we tried to write something back to explain what actually needed to be explained about these data as a way of both recognizing sort of maybe different ways you can interpret the data, but also the impact of that kind of analysis and what it would have on the Down syndrome community. This was at a very scary time where people were very frightened about COVID, given what Hilary showed around Down syndrome. And actually, there were some real concerns in terms of how the study was done. And I don't think people were thinking about how will people take the results from this study and interpret them, and what will it mean? Because it terrified people who couldn't understand the science or unpack what was actually going on in this pretty complex study. It made them think that even if they're vaccinated, they're still going to die if they get COVID. And that absolutely was not the case from the study. So it's a reminder about how we need to work, I think, to think about what are the messages from our data, how will people interpret them, and what do we need to do? So if we go to the next slide. So this is a visual of one of the ICS reports that we did with HCARD, looking at the study I'd mentioned where we looked at premature mortality as well as things like ALC status and being hospitalized or rehospitalized and having emergency department visits after a prior visit. So we worked together with people with disabilities, and we wanted to make sure in the report that we could actually show, so there's different sort of findings around recommendations, but they're paired with an explanation of the recommendation and then a particular quote from one of the people that we spoke with. We met with 2 different groups over the course of the study to really try to say, this is what this study means, and this is why this recommendation is important to me. So I think there are still ways, even when we're doing something just with administrative data, to engage with people when it comes to interpreting our data and helping people to understand the data. So if we go to the next slide. Okay, so again, this phrase, nothing about us without us, but now thinking about things we can do around dissemination. So we need to think about how accessible our information is and accessible to different groups of people with disabilities. So, we're not just thinking about, sensory disabilities, for example, or physical disabilities. We're also thinking about cognitive disabilities. But across disabilities, we need to think about sensitivity around what we message, what we say. So again, in work that Hilary's been leading and that I've been part of, looking at issues around perinatal care for disabled people, sometimes there's a sort of a concerning finding because there's a higher sort of relative risk for a particular thing that's bad, but it's still not very common. And so it was really important in having conversations and thinking about how we share and describe our information, really emphasizing or capturing how well many pregnant people with disabilities do, in addition to emphasizing an area where there needs to be some changes. So really thinking about how we message what we say and what is the impact. So again, sort of like intent versus impact. So what is the impact of something that is said to a disability community versus what we mean when we say it, and how you can work together to really iron those things out, I think, before studies are shared. And there's lots of interesting ways to share findings, right? So a lot of people don't read our papers, as we all know, but there's a lot of really interesting things we can do if we want to reach the people that we're actually studying in this research and work together with them to allow for changes and things to happen. So if we go to the next slide. So this is a visual of the slide that ICS was sharing on social media around advancing health equity through data, the way forward. And you'll notice in a little box at the bottom, there's a little black ALT. And if you click on that, for those of you who haven't done this before in social media, if you click on the ALT, if you're in Twitter and other social media, you can actually see an image description, and it says 2023 ICIS Research Forum, and it basically puts the same information that we see in the visual, if we can read it easily, that someone else would be able to see if they can't see the visual, Or if you had a cognitive disability that made it difficult for you to read, it might also be a way for you to use a screen reader and hear what is in that visual. So two things about that. Number one, everyone should use alt text when they're using social media, when they have images. But also, like, why do we do that? It makes it accessible for more people, but I'm going to give you another compelling reason to do it. And that is that you're actually showing that it matters to make it accessible to all people. So when I look at research findings, when I'm bored and I go on social media and I see different things that people are sharing, I get really happy when I see alt text because I say, oh, they thought that really mattered. Good on them, you know? And I know it's reaching more people, and I know there was an intention there. So it makes a difference that way. And just to say as well, I remember having a conversation. Sometimes what I do very politely, and I always say it in a very kind way, is I try to send a little direct message when I see something that is, particularly if it's disability related and it's not using alt text. And I just send a little message and I say, this is a great, study or a great resource. Love seeing it. Thank you so much for doing it. I noticed you didn't use alt text. It's not too hard to do, but it would be great if when you share this from now on, if you could do that, and usually people are pretty receptive. And then often people say, well, what's that? I don't know how to do that. And then I'll just send one or two links or references on how to do it. And they do. But one thing that's kind of interesting that happens is sometimes people say, well, that's great. We'll make sure for all of our disability stuff, we'll use alt text from now on. I'm like, okay, that's a step, but maybe people who are disabled also want to know about other things that aren't just about, bad things that happen to people with disabilities. So using alt text actually across the board is a really great thing to do if you have visuals, and it doesn't take very long. And there's lots of nice tips on how to do that. Next slide. So this is a visual, a lot of things in this picture. So if you can't see it, I'm just going to kind of describe some things I put in here. So it's how we explain things to people with intellectual or developmental disabilities, even again around ICS data. So there was a study that came out this last year looking at rates of depression over time for people who had participated in Special Olympics or people with developmental disabilities who had not participated in Special Olympics. And there's some important messages from the research really around how potentially something about Special Olympics, whether it's the actual physical activity or the engagement with other people on your team, not sure what it is, but something about that is protective in terms of future depression. But how do we get people with developmental disabilities who hang out and go to Special Olympics or who don't to know about that, right? So what we did a few things. We make easy reads, which are different than just having plain language. There's, again, some nice resources on how to do this, but you can see there's an image of someone who is a Special Olympics swimmer, and there's a summary title that is shorter and less complicated than the study title in the article. And then there's some links that say things like, what did we do in this study? What did we learn from this study? And there's images that go with maybe about 1 or 2 lines of text. So it's in easy reads, we try to have simpler language as well as images to describe what we're talking about. And we don't describe everything in the article. And the way we work on our easy reads at CAMH is we have a sort of an advisory group of people who meet with us regularly who help us with easy reads. And so the scientist comes and explains what's going on in the study. We put some images together, we sort of vet it, get feedback, and then we come back to them after to show them kind of how it went. So that was one way we thought about explaining this study. And then the other thing we did is we have a podcast, and the podcast is led by people who have intellectual or developmental disabilities. And in this case, one of them was also a Special Olympics athlete. So they're the hosts of the podcast, and they interviewed the first author of the study, Megan Lloyd, about the study and what it meant. So again, there's lots of different ways we can think about partnering with the people that we're studying to think about how we share information so that it makes sense to them and that they can be, part of our team when it comes to really pushing out or sharing what we learn. So I think I'm near the end. One more slide. Yeah. So big message here. I'm still learning. So I think I'm really good at figuring out, for the most part, how to work with people with developmental disabilities in my research. It's been part of my life for a very, very long time. But I haven't always thought about other kinds of disabilities, and I'm just gradually learning about that. Learning about, for example, why I need to make sure my slides are accessible to people, not just who can't comprehend certain complicated concepts, but maybe who can't see things as easily as I can. So it's a process for all of us, and there's nothing wrong with not knowing how to do this in a great way. It's just that same commitment we make to other areas where we want to learn and we want to be a good ally. So I think it's something we should all do and we can do. It's a really large part of the population that could be more included in all of our health services research. So my last slide just includes a couple of links to some references and things that are good to read, good to use. They're just a few examples of books, as well as a great podcast that has some specific interviews with doctors with disabilities. And then also some more guidance around how to do things like easy read and how to make things accessible. So yeah, enjoy learning. I think there's time for us to have questions.
Thank you, all three of you, for that great presentation. That was really informative. And I touched on so many different aspects that I think are important in this space. We have about 20 minutes or so for questions, and hopefully even we'll get a little break in between the formal start to the big forum. I saw a few comments in the beginning of the talk about, will these be available for download and will the recording be emailed after? I might defer to the event team just because I'm not sure if a platform is being made available for these resources or if they'd be available in another format. But we'll try and get that information to you. And then further down, I do see a question. And again, for people who would like to ask questions, we have the raise hand function at the top of your screen. And then to the right of the screen, there should be a speech bubble for the chat where you can add questions. Or there's also the question function, which is right below it. So one of the questions that I see here is about how disabilities were defined using administrative data. Maybe to touch on this point too, I'll mention that the H-card atlas that was mentioned throughout the presentation is available for download on the ICES external website. So if you go to ices.on.ca, there will be a tab for atlases and reports. And that information or that link will allow you to look through for the H-card report. Then the question was around if there's any work looking into disabilities with more hidden healthcare needs like high functioning ASD and Asperger's. So I'll open it up to the panel.
Yeah, I can start with that because we've done some work in the area of autism. There's also one study from Hilary that with us working together looking at a sort of preconception health for autistic women. And then we've done some stuff on, we did a study on premature mortality in autistic people and also some studies on healthcare use for young adults and for adults more generally. And there's also been some work looking at, algorithms in children. Where it gets messy with autism is, of course, and this is with many disabilities, sometimes our definitions change over time. So we're going to diagnose many more children who are autistic than we will adults. And we definitely need to go back. Hilary made that comment about looking at not just one point in time data, but really looking as far back in a person's lifespan as you can, especially with outpatient data, because you don't keep going to the doctor every time where the purpose of your visit is autism, right? So you really want to be able to capture when that diagnosis happens. And then there's certain groups who autism is less likely to be diagnosed as quickly. So we know there's gender differences and there's also racial differences. So we're not going to capture everybody, and it's really important to understand who we do see and who we do identify in our data when we decide on the algorithm that we're going to use. And maybe I would just add that it's really important to sort of complement what you learn from your administrative data with other sources or ways of collecting information. And so if we take the topic of, premature mortality, look at it through a couple different ways. Look at mental health, which is a huge issue for the autism community, and study some of the same constructs qualitatively using self-report data or informant family-based data, as well as administrative health data. And usually things come together, and then you feel more confident, I think, in your findings.
Yeah, being an employee at ICES, I was definitely struck by, the comment about the use of acronyms. We operate heavily using acronyms here at ICES. And so I think, having that reminder that, this space is very technical and it requires a level of translation on many different fronts. And I think the other piece too that, really stands out to me is, we do a lot of quantitative work, and that qualitative piece is incredibly important. Having that alongside the work that we do. And you showed some great examples of how that information can be disseminated and intertwined into the research that we do at ICES and elsewhere. Let me just check the questions. So I don't see any more questions. If anybody also wanted to raise their hand, please feel free. I'm going to put, just as the final slide, the contact emails for each of the speakers. Please, I think everybody is willing on this panel to, have anyone reach out to them for more questions or, kudos, because this was a great presentation, very informative. And I don't know if there's any final comments from the panel, but I think it's also fair to say, everyone might. Oh, we do have a question. There's a question from Madeline. How are people recruited most often? So maybe thinking about either including in the research, I'm assuming. So I'll leave that open to the panel if anybody wants to jump in.
I can jump in on that, and I'm sure Yona has thoughts as well. I think in terms of forming advisory groups of people with lived experience to give input on the research, it really is about building relationships, and sometimes it's sort of meeting with one group and then they suggest others. So for example, in our research on disability and reproductive health, we had a number of different contacts that our study team already had going into the project that we planned for when we wrote the grant, and we had letters of support sort of with people committing to being involved in the advisory committee. But our advisory committee really grew over time in response to the recommendations made by existing members. So for example, in our work, one of the recommendations was that we would have 2 peer researchers with disabilities as core members of the study team. This was a mixed method study that used both ICS data and qualitative data. So those 2 peer researchers co-led the qualitative data component, but they also played a really key role in developing our knowledge translation materials for the study as a whole. That wasn't something we had planned for in the original grant. It was something that was a recommendation of our advisory committee that we took. So I think it is sort of this like networking and kind of ballooning of the group that happens over time. And maybe one practical kind of recommendation I would make around that is to try to anticipate some of that need for flexibility in the grant submission. So as a relatively junior investigator, actually, I think that was the very first grant I wrote. I budgeted just for the advisory committee members that we had letters of support for. And then, of course, the advisory committee grew and we had peer researchers that were paid and that sort of thing. And so in subsequent grants, I've sort of built in more flexibility, knowing that that piece will probably change over time. But that's something that I sort of had to learn as I went with that. But yeah, it really is about sort of growing and listening to the initial members that you have.
Maybe a quick thing to add to that is that the time, so I usually, if I'm working with someone with an intellectual disability and it's an hour of their time for, say, a meeting or something that they're doing, I'm going to have an hour of time to prepare and support that. This isn't even their time. This is just our time to get ready. And then an hour of time to sort of formalize or put things together, or do the follow-up. So it's like 3 times as much time, right, as what it would be just for the time that that person is putting in terms of calculating things. And then the other thing is that, thinking about helping to continuously sort of grow your group of people who can work. So sometimes what happens is you've been involved in this kind of research for a while, and so you just end up being asked to be on every single study. And I think A, that's exhausting, and B, something can happen to you and then you can't participate anymore in that role. But also we want diverse voices and we want to keep building people's skill sets. And this is a job, right? So everyone should be paid for it. And there's a lot of people who are not employed who have disabilities, and we can build the capacity of people to do this kind of really important work if we keep sort of taking maybe someone who's already doing it and really good at it, and then making sure we're mentoring and supporting new people to be able to do similar kinds of work.
And then one of the next questions was around race and disability data. So the intersection of IDD, disability, and race or gender, kind of talking about the complexity of those items.
I mean, I think it's currently tricky with the lack of detailed race and ethnicity data that is available through health administrative data. I think the pandemic is changing the discourse around that, and there's increasing recognition of the importance of measuring race and ethnicity in health records. So hopefully in the future, I think that will be very important work to understand the intersection of racism and ableism. But at the moment, it has been challenging, and I think that's one of the reasons, again, for having other sources of data outside of administrative data to try to understand some of those experiences.
I was going to say, American reviewers don't know that about Canada, and it's always a question because it's always something we really can't comment on to the same extent. But we can talk about sex, although it's harder for us to talk about gender. And with certain kinds of disability groups, it might be really important because, for example, autism is more commonly diagnosed in males as opposed to females. And so if your cohort is heavily weighted toward males and you don't think about how you're going to deal with sex differences or stratifying by sex, you might be, it's important to understand those pieces and unpack them. So some of our work, some of Hilary's work obviously is looking at a particular sex, if we're looking at the perinatal period. And then some work we've just done sex stratified stuff. And I think that can be important, especially around something like premature mortality. You have to understand what's happening and incorporate sex into that.
I would just add here too, from our perspective around making sure that you're considering those intersectional pieces of disability and accessibility from the outset. I know, the data is evolving as we speak, especially on race and ethnicity. And for us to plan for what that's going to look like when the data is available is also important.
That's a great point. Yeah. The next question is commenting on small sample sizes. So small sample sizes being reported in studies shared, and we know the importance of reporting on the intersectionality, but with further disaggregations would result in even smaller samples. How would you suggest reporting on such measures?
I think it really depends on the outcome you're looking at. I mean, again, 20% of the population has a disability, so we're not talking about a small population. Certainly when you get into particular subgroups, particular types of IDD, for example, and very rare outcomes, then sometimes we do encounter small cell sizes, in which case, of course, we have measures that we use to ensure that we're protecting people's information by not reporting anything with a cell size less than 6. But I actually think that given how common disability is, there is a really great opportunity to be able to look at some of those intersections. So I think that will be an important area of work going forward.
And then the next question was, can you speak to the differences between Western versus non-Western view of disability and research and how that affects your work?
I'll quickly say that again, this is another example where when we're actually doing our work with ICS data, there's so much that we can do with those data, right? But how we think about the questions that we're asking, how we're thinking about how we're interpreting our findings, and how we're working with different communities and their understanding of disability and what those findings mean is really important. And I think it's important all the way, like Amy was saying, even before you have your data to look at, right? Why are you asking that question? What does it mean? Is this necessarily, why is this a bad outcome, right? Is it, says who? what do these things mean to different people? Yeah, I think there's probably a lot more work personally that I could do in that regard. But it's good to at least sort of be asking those questions. I don't know, Amy or Hilary, if you have anything to add.
Yeah, I will say that too. I would be the first person to say that in terms of thinking outside of non-Western ideas about disability, that is an area where I could definitely learn and grow. And kind of not at a loss for words, but thinking about our approach to this, I think that's one area where we would learn a lot from other ways of thinking about and incorporation of disability within our society. So I'll say that that's something I should be working on.
And for the last one, so definitely there's a value in hearing about your integrated KT activities with individuals with disabilities. Is there a framework that you use to guide these activities? And it's such an important component to our quantitative work at ICS.
I can jump in. I'm guessing Yona has thoughts on this too, and Amy as well. With our work, we've typically used like a terms of reference document at the very start of studies to try to come to a shared agreement of what our roles are as both researchers and community members on the study team. And it includes language around, respectful communication, expectations around contributions, expectations around acknowledgement, and that sort of thing. So I'm not sure if this is quite what the question is getting at, but just to say that I think it is really critical to have those conversations of what everyone's expecting in terms of their roles, and make sure that everyone's comfortable with it. And then we always call it a living document, and it evolves as we bring on new members and as we discover things that need to change through evaluations of our process as we go. But having that in writing has been really helpful, I think.
Yeah, I'm not sure of a particular framework. I mean, I like the general CIHR, what does integrated KT mean, and trying to think about those pieces. I think sometimes we're making these things up as we go. It's great to be able to read what different people are doing and finding out what's worked. Sometimes you learn what's worked with another population. You say, well, can we try that here? And again, going back to relationships, if you can develop strong relationships, you keep figuring out new things to try. And I think, it's thinking of it as a partner thing as opposed to a thing that you kind of dictate as a scientist. And I think humility is really important there. And I get things wrong all the time. And that's okay, and I hope that the spaces that we're in are kind of brave enough, right? So that when there are kinds of mistakes or things that happen, and we can find a way to talk about them and keep working through them, and have positive experiences.
Yeah, I would say very, very similarly that, there are some things that are standard practices that we can adopt every time that we do research, not just about people with disabilities, but when we're thinking especially of working with groups of people who have lived or living experience, that those needs will be very tailored to the people in those groups. And we might have those practices, but they may need to be changed or shifted based on the people in the group.
We have a few more comments. So another Lesley, spelled the same way. I rarely see that. Important to create a terms of reference, a working document to understand everyone's roles and expectations, including understanding expectations of research and institutions. For example, focus on publishing in academic journals, etc. And ongoing relationship building, not just at the beginning of a project. Some great points there. I want to maybe add to some of the final comments about that level of psychological safety that's needed in order to do this work and engage on many different levels. I think is really key. So I don't see any more questions. Again, I want to thank everyone for attending this workshop. I especially want to thank the presenters, Dr. Freier, Dr. Brown, and Dr. Lunsky. Thank you to the team behind this for helping us get on the platform and put the slides together. I did see a note that the slides will be, the recording will be available on demand. So this should be available for others to view. But with that, thank you very much for attending this morning workshop. We really appreciate your attendance, and I hope everyone enjoys the rest of the forum. And we'll each have a 5-minute break before that starts. So thank you again, and take care, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.